Thanks, Jess. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to receive this invitation to speak. As you can see, my subject today is on this topic, this really critical and very timely topic of how it is that the public sector can ensure successful AI adoption, not just AI adoption, but making sure it proceeds as intended. And my thesis for that and the major theme of my presentation is that the way you do that is by ensuring that there are mechanisms in place to hold vendors accountable and that there's a foundation for trust with them. We are living in a Wild West moment with respect to AI development, AI adoption, and often AI procurement. And that's not sustainable. It needs to change. We're living at a moment where this unstoppable force is meeting this immovable object of procurement. And actually, my hope is that in my remarks today, I'll show you guys that there are some real opportunities here for rethinking the relationship between tech procurement and the most recent AI technologies that are now being developed and deployed by some of the world's leading companies and laboratories. Just to, I know that Jess gave a very brief intro of myself, but I'll expand on that a little bit here so you kind of understand where I'm coming from here. As Jess mentioned, I have a PhD in machine ethics, as I named it 9 years ago. I began studying that topic almost a decade ago by designing a program in what we would now call AI ethics at UC Berkeley. And before that, it really helps to understand, I think, where I'm coming from here. I grew up in Appalachian, Ohio. So I'm from Southeast Ohio. I grew up on a sheep farm there. I spent more time around animals than people. And one thing that really seeped into me from a very young age is this awareness that many of the systems that had been created nominally to help people, whether that's healthcare or the job market or the education system, more often misrecognized people or did not serve them well. There was already, this was already when, Facebook was just coming up. There were a lot of new automated ways of people to connect with each other that actually made us feel even more isolated than we already were in Appalachia. And so then when I went to grad school on the West Coast, I realized, okay, AI is coming. AI is going to supercharge the way in which technology interconnects us. But unfortunately, by default, if we don't get implementation right, it's going to make the rest of the world feel and act more and more like Appalachia in all the bad ways. And that was a very powerful and very personal motivation for me to spearhead and this field to get in on the ground floor of it. So I was really the kind of resident sociologist, social scientist for several years in some of the world's leading AI labs coming out of Berkeley. And since 2018 have been organizing partnerships between the public and private sector in order to get AI implementation right. And now I am the founder and CEO of an AI startup called Hortus AI. And its goal, in a word, is really to create and scale a populist approach to AI adoption. So grounding the way in which AI tools are understood or used or implemented in a bottom-up way that's stakeholder-driven, where people are able to decide on their terms what successful adoption looks like, rather than a top-down approach that prioritizes the technology over human considerations. And so this is the perspective I'll be bringing here, and that's the frame through which I will be discussing these issues around AI trust, AI procurement, and what responsible adoption can mean. So we do need to set the stage a little bit here. I have a couple examples, really just in the last few months, of what I think the stakes are. On the one hand, some of you may have seen this headline of one of the founders of Business Insider actually used ChatGPT to kind of create and populate an entire, basically, facsimile of a newsroom of fake, business development folks, fake copy editors, fake news article writers. And then he wrote a blog post in which he confessed, basically, that within minutes of doing this, he found one of the facsimiles that ChatGPT created to be attractive, and he immediately started hitting on this AI agent. And it's a very interesting essay. I believe he's now taken it down because the public uproar about this was so extreme. But it was a really interesting case study of the ways in which the implementation of AI, not just tools, but collaborators into that workflow, immediately created the conditions for a toxic work environment, frankly, that he was responsible for. But not something, and there's a quote here in the corner showing, just he wasn't expecting something like this to even pop up and wasn't even sure if HR rules would apply here. Unfortunately, I can tell you that they definitely do if you're working in an environment with other people. So this is a major issue that we need to think about with AI adoption is not just can you use a tool to save you time or get marginal efficiency on your tasks, but is it actually, what is it going to do to your culture? What is it going to do to your organization? How is it going to change your relationships with other people in your office, especially as you're trying to serve public constituents? And meanwhile, I felt I had to add and just sort of acknowledge the elephant in the room here. We just saw the AI action plan that was released by the Trump White House just a few days ago. There's several interesting things in it. I do want to flag, I think the biggest headline grabber, which is this so-called ban on woke AI, basically attempting to make it so that when government agencies are using the leading and biggest large language models, that there's a kind of check on the use of those models if they have outputs that are labeled as excessively PC or woke or unduly sensitive to certain stakeholders in ways that at least the Trump White House thinks is not worthy of their time. I'm not going to say much about this other than I think it's a red herring and kind of a shiny object that distracts from the real issue, which is beyond just whether or not the model, whether or not the AI tool symbolically reflects our kind of cultural vibes or ideologies at a kind of like representational level. The real question again is like, how is its use going to transform what government is? Government is going to be and is being transformed by the capabilities that AI tools provide. And so rather than just having a checklist of ideas of whether you think the personality of the chatbot is or is not going to vibe well with your coworkers, the real question here is, what do you want government to be? How do you want your team to work? What relationship do you want to grow and facilitate with citizens, with your stakeholders, and with your affiliates? That's the real issue. And unfortunately, we're not seeing any leadership on this right now, frankly, from the White House or from, frankly, many of the other federal actors right now. But that is an opportunity. That's an opportunity for us to think about this question much more proactively. And what I mean by that is basically like we have to ask this question of how is it that government teams at the local level, at the state level, at the municipal level, or their affiliates such as nonprofits or public interest groups, how can they adopt technologies not just that claim to be trustworthy or safe, but in ways that the adoption itself ensures a foundation of trustworthiness, safety, and accountability. And so the focus for that is much less on just the model, the tool, and much more on the interface. What is the relationship the system will have with your constituents? What is the relationship it will have with the kinds of tasks you put it to? And how will you evaluate success? Not just how well performing is the model is in some abstract sense. So that's going to structure my remarks here. What I'm going to cover in order is, first of all, covering, I think, these really important concepts that get thrown around a lot, but are very rarely grounded in practice, which is, what do we mean when we talk about transparent AI, safe AI, and accountable AI? What does that really look like? And I'll give some examples that I think are very timely right now for that. Secondly, I'm going to talk about documentation, specifically the documentation of vendors. So when you have a vendor coming in, offering a tool, what are they giving you other than the tool? What have they written down? What assurances are they making or not? And how can you understand that? What are some different interfaces through which that documentation can be presented? And then third, I'll have a little bit to say about the vendor landscape itself and ways to engage vendors. There's actually more creative ways to engage vendors and to even co-create some AI implementations rather than being subject to this kind of vendor lock-in where they just give you whatever's out of the box and you take it or leave it. And then finally, I'll sum up, talk about, okay, what is the real value and risk to government teams at this moment and what can we do going forward? So starting off with here, I'm going to ground my remarks on transparency, safety, accountability in this really important and I think neglected distinction between and these terms are now getting used a lot, but they're often not sat with and really explained in a clear way that I think resonates with stakeholders. And that's this distinction between chatbots and agents. There's a lot of branding now. A lot of companies are claiming this is the year of agents or agentic AI. But I really want to explain what that is about, cut through the marketing about it, and explain the concrete difference this shift is going to make for government workflow. So to start off with here, and I apologize for those of you who think this is basic, but we need to be on the same page about what we're talking about here with these tools so that we can move forward. What is a chatbot? So my definition of this is really banal. It's very straightforward. It's not sexy, but it is accurate. And really the way we should think about chatbots is it's just a language model that passively responds to prompts that are given to it through some interface. Okay, that's it. It's just there's three parts of that. Okay, so it's a representation of language. It takes in prompts from some user that are in natural language. Okay, so you type a sentence, you type a word, you ask it a question, it parses that, and basically all it's doing is predicting what output is the best match, or even more literally, the lowest error rate, relative statistically speaking, to whatever was fed into it. All it's doing is passively matching. It's not deciding anything. Frankly, there's nothing really creative about it. There's a lot of marketing to suggest there is, but really there's not. A chatbot is just kind of taking things in and putting things out based off of whatever data it has seen in the past. Now, these language models are quite large, so often there can be a lot of data there. And that is often quite technically impressive, but it's entirely beholden to the prompt. The only active process here is what is being fed to it. The chatbot itself is quite inert. And that's actually reflected, I think, in famously ChatGPT. It's a very naked interface that's designed to be this blank slate for you to prompt or question or pitch basically whatever you want to and see what comes out. Now, that's different from an agent. Different AI people will give you different definitions of agent. I'm going to give you the one that I think shows the most operative distinction. So the way I'm defining an agent is it is something or someone that takes an active role in order to achieve goals. Okay. So an agent is trying to do something. It has a goal in mind and it is taking actions in some sequence in pursuit of that goal. And the closer it gets to the goal or the faster it gets to it, that's how it understands success. So at root, it's an active process. It is not a passive process. It is not just matching inputs versus outputs relative to someone who is prompting it. It has its own agenda. Okay, and I think those actually even might share the same Latin root word, although don't quote me on that. Now I'm just making this distinction because often in popular culture, when we think about AI agents, I think that image of agents from the Matrix is what comes to mind. That famous image that I showed here of like they're wearing sunglasses, they all have the same suit, and they're this kind of nefarious, duplicitous, secret, and totalitarian entity that's evil and bad. That's not what I mean by agent. An agent is really more like someone who is a coworker. It might be somebody in your workplace. It might be, if you're a government worker, it might be somebody who works in an adjacent department or someone who works in your department, or it might be just somebody who's managing some other part of the workflow. But the point is, they are trying to do something. You may understand what that is. You may communicate with them about what you're doing relative to what they're doing, but you're not directly prompting them and waiting for responses. They have their own agenda going on. And that's a very important qualitative distinction in terms of what work feels like when something like that is alongside you. So an agent can be a person. Okay, every single person has agency in the sense of they have their own goals that they're pursuing, but an AI agent is also an agent in this sense. And that's really what's exciting and I think kind of scary about what's coming and where these latest technologies are going. So to sum that up, chatbots are passive, agents are active. Chatbots really are about saving you time. They're really about convenience. They're about efficiency, outsourcing a workflow that you've already decided how to do it, and just they take specific tasks and they break that down. Whereas an agent is collaborative and it executes. It will take its own actions regardless of whatever specific prompt may have catalyzed that action. And the risks are distinct too. So whereas a chatbot, famously, of course, chatbots run the risk of hallucinating or saying inaccurate or gobbledygook things, agents misbehave. Okay, think about that more in a Sorcerer's Apprentice type way. The brooms that just repeatedly like fill the well with water. Agents might be misaligned with what they're supposed to do because they're pursuing a goal that might not have a clear relationship with the wider workflow. So I'm going to give some quick examples of this. If you're a chatbot and you're using a chatbot to parse legal documents, chatbots can be very helpful. Chatbots can, for example, they can summarize briefs, they can propose edits to the document or to the brief, and they can also, if you're interested in saying, hey, can you help me understand this? They can help you with that. So that's the basis on which you're prompting them. Now, the problem with that is they're only as good as your prompts. If you don't know how to prompt it well, or you don't kind of have a sense of what the chatbot will understand or be able to match inputs on the outputs for, it's not going to do a very good job parsing. Now, the technology for that is constantly growing and evolving and improving, but that's the game. The prompt is the critical, vulnerable part of a chatbot interface. Now, for an agent, it's different. An agent is able to create, execute, and defend legal arguments. An agent will have its own goals about what success looks like from a legal document standpoint. An agent could also apply statutes in novel situations. So if you're feeding it a legal document and you want to say like, hey, can you apply this to understand this policy or help us shape a policy around this? The agent won't just suggest things, it might start doing things, talking to stakeholders, soliciting feedback. It will take whatever actions it needs to be secure in the goal that has been given to it. And the result of that is that there's an unstable relationship with legal standing here. Because if you're using AI agents to do this kind of work, they may start asserting or impacting the legal standing of certain constituents or stakeholders in ways that may or may not fit with your own understanding, which is a very different kind of risk than a chatbot that just might occasionally hallucinate or not respond well to your prompts. Another example, if you're using these kinds of tools for citizen engagement, a chatbot might help you draft external communications or transcribe meetings, whereas an agent is going to be able and comfortable and might even want to directly engage citizens and stakeholders or take unto itself responsibility for managing public services. That's a very different onus of operation there. So whereas a chatbot, it's possible that the outputs it's generating might be stale or be worse than if they'd been managed by your previous human-driven workflow. For an agent, it's going to directly change the relationship you have with stakeholders. It's a major shift in capability, and it's a very different kind of risk. There's also a very different kind of opportunity there, but that's really where we're heading with agentic AI. Now, to ground this in vendors, why does this all matter? Well, because the way in which AI vendors and the people building frontier AI capabilities think about this stuff is they're designing agents that are trying to see farther and farther into the future in pursuit of some goal. Okay, and so really the game there is how do we get enough data and structure this learning environment for the agent so that it can more and more reliably pursue whatever goals we're giving to it in a deterministic environment. Okay, and that just means an environment where they can comfortably decide and predict what the next actions are to take. But that's very different than the context in which I think government workers and public interest groups are operating, which is a world where you're not just concerned with the accuracy of a model, you're really concerned with the integrity of whatever the activity is that this AI is going to be used for. So again, the question there, if you're designing an agent, for example, a self-driving car that's going to navigate roads on your streets, you're not really concerned with how reliably this thing can recognize stop signs. Now, obviously that matters, but it matters for safety. And the way in which safety works is in terms of a stakeholder relationship. So it's not really the safety of the car that matters, it's the safety of the road. And it's the way in which these new technologies can change the way roads work, change the way policing works if you're using, computer vision algorithms there, or predictive policing, or changing the way constituents communicate either on social media or with your own offices. That's ultimately what's at stake. And those are the commitments you should be really most concerned about from the vendor. The development of AI agents makes that problem all the more extreme because it means that vendors need to account for the decisions that they're making about what agents may be likely to do or want to do in these situations where they directly affect stakeholders and constituents. So to sum that up there, when we talk about the transparency of a tool, of an AI tool, or how safe it is, or what it means to hold it accountable, what we're actually talking about, what's actually at stake is how do you hold the vendor accountable? And is the vendor safe in the way they're going to implement this in practice with your own workflow and your own constituents? So transparency, safety, and accountability are not model properties. They're not really about the specific discrete tasks an AI might be used for. They're really about, is this tool going to be something I can stand behind in my relationship with my other coworkers? Is it going to be something that my citizens or constituents are going to want to use or tolerate or like as a way to improve their understanding of public services? In other words, it's really about, is the vendor going to help me improve services, not just make them more efficient by promising a high-performing model? So we've teed up that conversation now in terms of this shift from thinking about these sorts of values, not so much in terms of the tool and more in terms of the vendor. So next thing I'll talk about is, okay, what does that mean for vendors? What kinds of documentation could or should we be looking for from them so that we can actually see if there is that foundation for trustworthiness? So first of all, as a refresher, what do we mean by AI documentation? What does it mean to document AI tools, AI teams, AI models? What is that term of art capturing? I think it's capturing two things. And so I'm going to talk about these things and give some examples of what this looks like in practice. So AI documentation is any material that makes AI tools more legible, as distinct from merely transparent or fair. In other words, if all you're doing is telling me that this model is going to be accurate 98% of the time at, writing emails to people who are in your office, that's not really what I mean by documentation. And I think that's actually not good documentation. Good documentation would explain, here is what you can understand about the tool in terms of the way it's working. And here is how other people who may interact with this tool will understand its operation. Okay, they may not care what the specific number is on how accurate the model is, but they may care about, would I trust myself to reply to an email that this AI tool has just sent to me? Do I know where that's going to go? If so, why? What guarantees are there on that? If it misbehaves, what is the vendor going to do, if anything? What can I do, or if anything, if it misbehaves? That's getting more at the spirit of documentation, good documentation. And the second point, following from what I just said, what it's supposed to do is provide information about the vendor that helps you understand their definition of good or bad AI behavior. In other words, it helps you understand what is the context that the use of this tool will create. How will the way in which my team communicates, in other words, change if half of our emails are now edited or even drafted and sent by an automated system to each other? That's what I want to know from a vendor. If the vendor isn't telling me that, how can I really understand and have a clear grasp on what it means for me to trust the tool? If the whole purpose of the tool is going to be to so thoroughly make more efficient and scalable how we communicate, that the communication bandwidth itself is totally different than what it was before. So I'm not trying to scare you guys. I'm just trying to point out, like, there's a way to document this stuff, and that's what good documentation looks like, and it's what you should be looking at from vendors. Now, here's some examples of that. There's a few different pathways along which this kind of documentation can be structured. One is you can audit the tool. Either the vendor can allow an audit by providing access through an API, or you can just solicit a third party and just see how far they can get with it. And so, for example, there's a foundational paper in my field called Gender Shades, which did an audit of, at the time, leading facial recognition software. As you can see here, some of them provided by Microsoft and IBM. And what that showed was that the tools in question were trained on data that was disproportionately white and male. So the result there was this kind of structural bias, not just model bias, okay, in terms of accuracy, but structural bias in terms of demographics and features of those models, where they were systematically more accurate on certain kinds of faces than others. Now, does that matter? Now, I think it does for my own reasons, but I think in terms of your workflow, something like this also matters. Not so much because we want a tool that's perfectly accurate on all faces. We may want that, but what we really want is assurances about how it will perform. And the value of this documentation was to show that there were not assurances in place about the variety of different stakeholders whose interests would be involved and affected by the scalable deployment of this software. So that was the real contribution of this kind of audit. And you can solicit audits like this now on any number of tools that are available. Another example, sort of parallel, it's a somewhat different methodology, is what's called algorithmic impact assessments. So AIAs, as they're known, are basically a way to define relationships between the AI developers or the vendor on the one hand and regulators on the other, based off of established measurements for specific types of harms and specific types of impacts evaluated relative to some counterfactual scenario. And I have a citation here for what this can look like, and this little summary here showing what the difference is from algorithmic audits. So the idea here is with an AIA, what you're really trying to do is define these scenarios or situations of potential impacts of some algorithm, some algorithmic system, before the system is in use. So the idea, and I already gave an example of this, basically if you're thinking about, okay, if we're going to onboard an AI agent and it's going to start monitoring and even drafting a non-trivial proportion of our emails, what are the potential risk scenarios where, like, if we get a late night call from a constituent about, X topic, and suddenly it's filtered through this automated system, what are the worst things that could happen? Or just what could happen in that case? Is the agent going to respond? Is it going to know not to? Is it going to refer the query by classifying it as urgent or as risky to a human operator or not? Right? That's a very different kind of workflow than just a model that purports to be super accurate in all instances. But these are the kinds of things that an AIA is designed to address through these potential scenarios. And so it's another potential avenue of what could be documented about a system before it's being widely deployed, because that way you're able to anticipate and define risks before they happen and before they manifest. So another example, and this is more another version of documentation protocols that are used more specifically in industry, is what's called there are two very common ones here: data sheets and model cards. So data sheets and model cards are protocols. They're really one-pagers that are designed to summarize the most critical information about an AI tool in order for somebody who might implement that tool to decide if that's the right tool for them to use. So for example, to return to this case of facial recognition software, there's now hundreds or even thousands of facial recognition models that could be used on almost any use case you can imagine. But what a model card would show you is it would list specifically what data was that model trained on, when was it collected, which jurisdictions were involved, if any, were data protections in place for those people, will data protections be in place for the people whose faces are then classified by this tool once it's in practice? How accurate is it on certain kinds of features? Why were those metrics chosen by the vendor? This is the kind of information that a model card, at least a robustly documented model card, is supposed to show. And that can be very valuable from the standpoint of a developer, because what they're able to do is see and compare the model card of that tool against other computer vision tools, for example, to see, okay, this one may be more accurate, but this one's better documented in terms of where the data was collected from. Or this one is a state-of-the-art model, but there isn't as much record of how it engages with actual stakeholders or interest groups. And so we don't really have an understanding of how it is that their relationships are going to be handled by this thing when it's deployed in practice. So ideally, what a model card also is capturing is recommendations and what caveats on the performance need to be kept in mind for a context of implementation to be understood. And again, I keep circling back to this point in my remarks because it's super critical. The question here is, what is the context that is going to be created or induced or reinforced by the AI? And not just how accurate is the vendor claiming it's going to be for this completely isolated task that they happen to have defined in a jar and thrown a lot of data at just to see what sticks. So these aren't audits, and often I should caveat my own remarks here to say one major limitation of data sheets and model cards is that they often rest on self-report data and self-report documentation from the vendor. So you're basically you have to already sufficiently trust the vendor to be honest and forthright about their documentation procedure in order to lend a lot of credence or credibility to what is put here. But I think in tandem with the auditing protocols that I discussed earlier, or with AIAs that your own team or department or larger public organizational structure might be able to support, they can be very powerful. Because what that can let you do is not just anticipate what the risks are, but they can really help you assess the vendor and decide, is this the right vendor for us? Rather than, is this off-the-shelf tool just something that we know is going to technically suffice? And we might as well just see how far we get and just let the cascading waterfall of implementation take things where they go, let 1,000 flowers bloom, see what sticks kind of thing. So this is my overview of where documentation can get us. And so to sum up what I think the insight here is that when you're the choice about which vendor you go with, and here we're beginning to circle closer and closer to the procurement conversation, choosing the right vendor, 95% of it, even if we're talking about AI, is about getting on the same page. It's really not about the tool. Most of it's not even technical. You really should not have to know very much about artificial intelligence, computer vision, reinforcement learning, large language models. Very little technical knowledge is needed if the vendor has done a clear, robust, and trustworthy job of backing up their claims about what they've built and what it means to implement it. If the vendor offers to help with the implementation, great. If the vendor isn't offering to help with the actual implementation, can they at least provide guarantees on what good implementation looks like? Are they not just selling you snake oil, where the snake oil is not just because the model isn't as good as they say, it's because there's something about the way in which this tool will play with legacy systems or be understood or interpreted by other people on your staff, in your workflow, or external folks. Is there going to be something screwy going on there that you can mitigate, or that you can at least anticipate and control for? These are the kinds of features that vendors are responsible for, because vendors are the ones supplying not just a tool, but really the way I think we should truly understand AI capabilities now as more like public infrastructure or more like utilities. So we really ought to think of it through that frame. If you're thinking about an electric utility, it's not really that useful to know, what the kilowatt hours of, the energy output of the power plant might be. You really want to know, like, can we hook this thing into the grid, and can it reliably provide power to people in ways that they can depend on? That's what makes the difference between a trustworthy vendor and somebody who you don't know from Adam. That's the kind of guarantees we should look for. And I think several of the protocols I just mentioned, whether that's external audits, whether that's model and vendor documentation provided through model cards, or whether that's these algorithmic impact assessments, this is a very useful toolbox that I think all can be brought to bear and really should be brought to bear over the course of a successful procurement, which is the next topic I'm going to transition to now. When we're talking about the vendor landscape, what's actually out there? What does it mean to engage a vendor today who's providing AI tools? And what are some different avenues or dimensions through which that landscape can be understood and parsed in a coherent way, in an intelligent way, in a responsible way? So I'll be talking about here a few different procedures by which you can parse this landscape. In particular, I'll touch on procurement itself, at least at a high level, in terms of like what's at stake in procurement and how that operates, as well as pilots, and also shared service models, which is actually a topic that I'm very excited about and where I think there's a lot of potential. Okay, so to again establish this context here, many of you may be familiar with these case studies. These are actually now, I think now over a year old, these particular ones, but unfortunately, I think we are still living in the world that these case studies instantiate. So we've seen several, I mean, more than several now, honestly. I think we've seen hundreds of examples, reported or not, of often a chatbot that has been deployed by either enterprise or by even a very large city, basically as an experiment to see how this thing is going to interact with constituents, whether those constituents are citizens or whether they are consumers. And for the most part, what we've seen is that those early deployments were an unmitigated disaster, where the results either ended up in court or they so thoroughly destroyed or eroded public trust in the interface through which that tool was being provided, that the entire case study basically fell apart, and there was egg on the faces of a lot of the folks involved. So these examples here, I'll just briefly take you through this. There's this case of, and this already went to court and was resolved, which is that Air Canada had deployed a chatbot, which I believe was derived in its case from ChatGPT, although I'm not sure if it was specifically ChatGPT, but it was basically a frontier chatbot, a leading edge chatbot, technically speaking, that was actually responsible for, and in some cases allowing policies to be created or riffed on or negotiated if consumers learned how to mess with it in the right way. So it turns out that, especially like in the early days, it was fairly easy to find certain kinds of prompt engineering techniques to get these chatbots to make claims or stand by or promises, commitments in terms of policies that the company itself really didn't want to be responsible for. I don't have a slide on it, but there's another example where there was a case, I believe, of a Chevy Tahoe being sold to somebody in California right off the lot, like a brand new 2025 model for $1. Somebody said they only had $1 to spend, and could the chatbot provide a car for the total amount that they could pay? And the chatbot said, "Happy to oblige. Yes, $1 is sufficient." And then the person said, "Can you also promise that's legally binding?" And the chatbot, the poor chatbot said, "Yes, I can confirm that's legally binding. You only need to pay $1." And so it's important to understand these chatbots might be incredibly capable and very accurate at quote unquote understanding the prompts that are given to them, but they're often designed to be sycophantic. They're often designed to be people pleasers. They're very allergic to disagreeing or saying no. And when they do, it's often in a kind of corporate speak that doesn't really mean anything, and that people can usually prompt their way into messing with or finding a workaround for. So these case studies here of Air Canada, this was taken to court, where it turns out they had to honor the policy that this chatbot just invented on the fly to appease a consumer, is an example of what the potential risk was here. And then there's this other famous case study now of New York City, which has this platform called My City. And there's a My City chatbot that they procured as in order to support that. And they basically were caught that the chatbot in question, that the case study that happened there was, I believe it was intended for small business owners to use. So the way they handled this procurement was that they had fine-tuned the chatbot on particular use cases that would matter for small business owners in New York City. And at least one small business owner said, "Okay, I'm thinking of expanding my leasing space, but I'd like to know what the costs would be for a fire insurance policy on this. Can you help me through that process financially?" And the chatbot, I believe, said something like, "Well, I could do that, or you could just burn down your business and just collect arson insurance on it already, and then you'd actually make more money than actually having to insure yourself further against fire. So it was like encouraging people to burn down their own businesses. It had probably learned online that there's other cities and jurisdictions where that's common to do, but it accidentally was reinforcing that behavior. And so that caused a huge snafu, a kerfuffle for New York City. Mayor Eric Adams, who has his own problems these days, decided not to take it down. That they kind of build this as a learning process and learning experiment. But the result is a lot of people just lost faith in my city, and they lost faith certainly in the chatbot because it became clear that its purpose and what it was trying to do was not really help people so much as be a people pleaser, and by extension, just sort of like pilot test this new platform that they wanted to see how far they could get. I think in terms of their agreement with Microsoft, actually, in their case, was how that came about. So this has been the kind of weird situation that procurement has been in around frontier AI capabilities, which is that however impressive those capabilities are of a chatbot or of an agent in the abstract, in actual practice, it's really not clear how this thing will interact with people, what trust looks like, and what guarantees are really being placed on its performance in terms of what is this new kind of interface going to mean for people when they come to depend on it or are looking for critical information from it. And so I think we're in the middle of a big sea change here. This is beginning to resonate actually with things that I'm working on with my company, which maybe in the Q&A, I'm happy to share a bit more about informally. But the sea change that we're really seeing here for procurement is that instead of a situation where the designer or the vendor in some completely dissociated contextless sense is able to just create an agent and just define willy-nilly whatever goals or whatever rewards against whatever planning horizon it might make sense for that thing to pursue. Instead, what we're really seeing is that both within industry itself and also on the government side, there's this very interesting parallel between the way in which large language models and the computational infrastructure behind them is being built. There's a very interesting parallel between that and the process of procurement. So the process of procurement, of course, is famously can be quite Byzantine and can look very different in different jurisdictions. It can look very different in different jurisdictions, and there can be different thresholds for when procurement is activated or kicks in, based off of basically like the size of the contract or how much money needs to be on the table before this full process is followed. And if I were to take you through what this looks like in Virginia, where I just lived, to California, where I live now, these would be very different processes in terms of the paperwork needed. But the analytic workflow, I think, is often the same. There's some kind of an establishing of needs, or there's some kind of RFI put out to basically say, okay, we're looking for some kind of tool or functionality or capability to achieve this thing that will help our legacy systems to work in this way. That then transitions into this kind of phase of sourcing and evaluating, and people basically then put in proposals. Vendors put in proposals, say, yeah, we could meet this requirement. Our tool works this way. We fit into these things. There's communication then that happens with these government entities, which culminates in some kind of contracting process, and then an agreement about the contract itself. Okay, here's what it means to honor that and proceed on that in a way that all parties understand what's on the level. Now, what's interesting here is that this, again, is kind of parallel to this multi-stage process by which vendors are developing large language models themselves. There's this kind of sourcing process of taking lots of different data sets and prompts from users, which is then coalesced into some kind of learned model, some representation of some actual task, which is often like parallel to the specifying requirement stage of procurement. Then there's this testing and evaluation stage, which is a common version of that is red teaming. Red teaming is basically a situation where humans are trying to prompt or probe a model once it's been trained to see if it will misbehave on certain use cases, or they can rank the different outputs based on how good or productive they are for the task in question. And then finally, once that's in place, there's this training process where the model is basically given, as I've mentioned before, some definition of a goal or reward, and then there's this process by which the pre-trained model that's been shown all this data of prompting and predicting and matching is then trying to then learn specific tasks and specific goals that may be given to it. And so what's interesting is that although one of those, I've described two processes on this slide that are, in terms of sociologically speaking, very different people do these things, and they're very different kinds of expertise. One is very computational and technical and frankly quite esoteric just because it's so new. And the other is often also quite esoteric and Byzantine in a sense because it's so old or because it's so bureaucratic or because it's such an established legacy process of somebody who's been working in the same government office for the last 20, 30, 40 years, who's the point person for procurement. But actually what we're seeing on the ground is that successful AI procurements tend to be ones where this process of documenting the development of the language model happens in parallel with the process of procurement. So that's, I think, this very productive way that we can avoid vendor lock-in, where you don't just have a chatbot or an agent out of the box that the vendor is saying, I'm going to promise you the world with this tool, take it or leave it. Instead, and then procurement happens after that. Instead, what you have is more of a conversation where something is wanted by the public sector or some department or some team. A vendor is then able to say, oh, okay, what we could do is fine tune a pre-trained model based off of the criteria you're interested in. And this would be the scoping of the terms. Here's what the requirements would be. Here's what infrastructure we could offer you. And then that provides a basis for the contracting. And so actually, although the worlds of government procurement and AI development might seem very alien to each other and very opposed to each other, they're actually profoundly aligned structurally. And there's an enormous potential there if we embrace that parallel for, I think, new kinds of partnerships. And so I'm going to go through just a few examples of that right now. One example is when we talk about pilot programs. We're looking at, there's an emerging ecosystem of groups. Some of them affiliated with universities, some of them affiliated with nonprofits or their labs based in nonprofits, which provide opportunities for vendors or with anyone really who could build an AI capability to collaborate directly with stakeholders to co-design AI tools that work for their own often neglected use cases. So as much as it may be true that, ChatGPT is this, horizontal app that promises to be able to do any number of things, just no matter how you prompt it, in actual practice, there's any number of use cases that government or civil society groups may be concerned with that are being neglected in the market just because they're not something that the top AI vendors happen to care about. I just was talking with actually somebody who works in the procurement division of Sacramento, who is telling me that like every week his team spends many, many hours trying to parse these use cases they have for which there isn't an AI tool, but for which they want one. I think the example he was giving me was to say that they were looking for an automated system that could manage the way to assign different like grave diggers in cemeteries across Sacramento, so their time shifts were able to be not only coordinated with each other, but also 24/7, because you want somebody on staff in a cemetery, at least one person all the time, but also in a way that actually protects all the legal constraints and compliance standards of the fact that you've got, dead bodies in that area. There's certain like health requirements for that. There's these weird particular kinds of compliance that matter. And that's an example of a niche, but, pretty important use case, because what are we really talking about there? The ability of a city to manage its own population of cadavers once they're in a cemetery. That's an important use case. You need something to be able to do that, but it's something that they couldn't find any of the big vendors helping them with. And so there's examples of, and I'm giving us several different, on this slide, just cases where there are groups and organizations that have now set themselves up to work directly with stakeholders to say, hey, instead of starting with a model In other words, instead of starting with a solution and then just seeing if we can find problems that match that solution, let's try and start with the problems that cities are facing, that the public sector is facing, that nonprofits are facing, that educational systems may be facing, schools, hospitals, health clinics. What do they actually need? What is it that they really need help with? And can we actually build tools that fit those needs? And so there's some examples here, and several of you you may have heard of these groups already: the Open Technology Institute, the GovLab, Rethink AI, which is a group that's based in New America, but which my company is an affiliate of, is one of these groups that's now pursuing pilots, I believe, with the city of Boston and several other cities across the country, to basically make it so that there's direct community-driven feedback that's involved in this process of even defining what the goals of a successful procurement would be. So literally either polling citizens or asking them, what do they want from AI tools? What do they want help with? And then using that as a basis to match them with potential tools. And also the AI for Impact program, which I have a screenshot there of some of the folks involved in that. So if any of you are interested in these kinds of pilot programs that put the problems first and then look for solutions for them, there are methodologies for that in place, and there are teams for that in place that are nationwide. And I would encourage you to get in touch, or I could help you to get in touch with any of these folks in order to become an affiliate or become a member and get the process moving on that. And often these pilot programs, I should add, are distinct from legacy procurement in the sense that usually they've been structured to make it so that the triggers for a formal procurement process are higher than whatever the process of these pilots would be. So a successful pilot could then lead to a more formal, even multi-year procurement. But the pilot programs are sort of like an incubator for what a responsible procurement could be by trying it out on the ground with local community interests. And then, I have a final example here of what I'm calling, shared service models, which I'm very excited about. This is kind of a passion project for me. We have now seen in the last couple of years a series all over the country in different jurisdictions, the launch of what are called community information exchanges. And I've included a definition of what a community information exchange is on the slide. They're basically a technology platform that is really just not meant to make an existing process more efficient. What they're designed to do is transform how organizations across a given city coordinate human services and ensure community equity. So again, the idea is not just that you have an AI model that could be, used as part of a chatbot that a hospital deploys in order to help automate scheduling meetings between patients and doctors. There's nothing community information exchange about that. A community information exchange would be a platform that is able to coordinate the way that health clinics, that social workers, that parents, and employers understand and can facilitate community well-being by understanding, here is where my process ends and your process begins. So a community platform, I kind of like to think of it as, it's almost like if an AI system, because these are often AI-driven processes, they're data-driven, they are often rooted in predictive matching of for example, patients onto doctors or employers onto health plans. They're really a way to stitch communities together, to integrate a community's needs in ways that serve that community and don't just save hospital administrators money, or don't just save a doctor 30 minutes of their day by automating scheduling, or don't just, make it so that you don't have to write quite as many emails per day as you do now. There's nothing wrong with any of those things, but a community information exchange is a much more, I would even describe it as a progressive vision for the way in which AI capability can augment and reinvent public services using data, using prediction, and using automation, rather than just taking an existing silo and making it more accurate, possibly at the expense of making it equitable or fair or trustworthy or legible to certain constituent groups. There are several examples of community information exchanges that have either already launched or are in process. I know one major leader is San Diego. So for those of you who'd like to learn more, I would really encourage you to look at the San Diego CIE, which has kind of served as a blueprint that now a lot of other cities take inspiration from. So I know that there's a Chicago CIE that exists as well, and Columbus, Ohio, actually close to where I'm from, Southeast Ohio. I know the Columbus folks, and they're very excited about partnering with new groups of AI vendors, as well as local health clinics, as well as soup kitchens, and also even churches, different religious denominations, because often they serve this community support role. They're all seeking them as partners in the Columbus CIE. And so there's really a lot of potential for lots of other cities across the country, if they're of a certain size and have a certain amount of infrastructure, to be able to stitch together these disparate services through data analytics into something really qualitatively beyond, and that will ultimately induce trust rather than erode it with their own citizens over time. So I'm almost done. I'll now wrap up and say, in conclusion, what do I think is the value and what is the risk to government teams when we think about AI procurement, when we think about AI risk, when we think about what it means for AI to be safe or trusted or transparent? So what have I said to you guys? I think that AI trust, what it means to trust AI is overwhelmingly about vendor trust. Can the provider, can the builder of the tool make commitments to ensure successful adoption of what they've built, and not just the performance of how their tool works in their own controlled laboratory setting? Second, trustworthiness and accountability really depend on documentation. Is the vendor forthright about what they've built, how it works, and who it is for? Or are they not being forthright? What should they be forthright about in order for you to decide that they're the right vendor to work with? And how can you set up that communication with them so it's sustained over the course of an implementation? And then finally, and I'll just to really distill the last point I was making, AI itself is becoming the fulcrum around which tech procurement pilots and shared services rotate. AI is not just something that is being procured. AI is becoming procurement itself. The process of procurement has a very powerful structural alignment and parallel with the way AI is developed and the way it works. And what we're going to see is lots of different legacy government services and public services get reinvented through AI, because what it means for them to implement and integrate technology is increasingly being something that AI is taking over. I do think there's a powerful vision there for communities to lead that conversation, for stakeholders to play a much more active role, and for them to decide what their own problems are before they seek out solutions. And I think that's really where we should look for leadership now, in a moment where we will need to start local and need to start with communities in order to get this right. So with that, I'm happy to stop and take any questions from the group. Hopefully Jess can help field some of those, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you, and I hope this has been helpful and clarifying at a moment of truly profound and rapid and radical change in the culture of both procurement and of the future of AI. So thanks very much for your time.